Hello and welcome. My name is Suzanne Wagstaff. I am the Director of Alumni Networks and Regional Programs, and I work for the Washington University Alumni Association. I am very excited to welcome our alumni, parents, current students, and friends to today's virtual tour of the St. Louis Art Museum's exhibition, Currents 118, Elias Sime, featuring presenters Hannah Clem and WashU alumna Molly Moog. Now, before we begin, I'd like to explain the format for today's session. You will only hear and see me, today's presenters, and their presentation. Today's presentation is offered via closed captioning. You may enable your closed captions by clicking in the CC Live Transcript button on your Zoom toolbar on your screen. Today's program will last about 1 hour, and we encourage you to participate and interact by introducing yourself in the chat box. We also encourage you to ask questions at any time. To do that, you could type a question in the Q&A or the chat box at any time during the talk. Following the presentation, we will have time for more questions. This webinar is being recorded, and we will share it on the Alumni Association YouTube channel and on our website following the event. It is now my pleasure to introduce today's presenters. Hannah Clem is the Associate Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art at the St. Louis Art Museum, where she curates the museum's Currents and New Media Series exhibitions. She was previously the Fisher Collection Graduate Curatorial Fellow at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, where she worked on the Contemporary German Art Collection. Hannah holds her doctorate from the University of Chicago, a master's degree in art history from the Courtauld Institute of Art, and a bachelor's degree in art history with honors from Sarah Lawrence College. Clem has received several fellowships and awards, including a 10-month research fellowship from the German Academic Exchange Service at Humboldt University in Berlin. Molly Moog is a research assistant at the St. Louis Art Museum in Modern and Contemporary Art and a curatorial assistant at the Mildred Lane Kemper Art Museum. At the St. Louis Art Museum, she has contributed to exhibitions including Rachel White-Reed, 2019, Kehinde Wiley, St. Louis, 2019, and the museum's ongoing Currents and New Media exhibitions. At the Kemper, she contributed to the exhibition Ai Weiwei, Bare Life, 2019, among many others. Molly is an alumna of Washington University. She received her bachelor's degree in art history and Spanish with honors in 2012. Please help me welcome Hannah Clem and Molly Moog.
Thank you, Suzanne. Thank you also to WashU for hosting us for this presentation. And I just wanted to say a quick hello to all the alumni, other fellow alumni joining us, and also a special hello to my classmates and to my art history friends who might be watching. Hannah and I are really thrilled to be able to talk to you all about Currents 118, Elias Sime, which is the latest show in the museum's long-running Currents series of exhibitions of contemporary art, which has been running since the 1970s. And this exhibition presents recent and new work by Elias Sime, who is an internationally recognized contemporary artist from Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. And I'm going to hand it over to Hannah to start out by telling us a little bit more about Elias's work.
Thank you so much, Molly, and welcome to everybody. I've always had such wonderful interactions with Washington University alumni, so it's a privilege for me to be here as well. So as Molly said, Elias Sime's work is the 118th iteration of our Currents Contemporary Art Exhibition series. And for Currents, what we do is we work with a living artist on creating a combination of new and never before seen work for the art museum. And so we pick artists based on a wide variety of things. We have a fellowship that works with Washington University that we have artists participate in, but sometimes also we just have relationships with international contemporary artists like Elias Sime, who come to St. Louis and work with the museum and the collection to create a new body of work. So this show has been a real privilege. Elias is based in and lives in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. And for the last decade, he's become really well known for creating these modular artworks that are made out of electrical wires, components from computers, transistors, cell phones, keyboards. And he's become really known for this process of taking all of this material and creating these really beautiful, almost collaged artworks. And you'll be seeing a lot of them. And we have to say the show is up right now. The art museum is open, obviously with a lot of safety protocols in place, but hopefully this will also, if you can't make it to the show, be able to see some of the works and see the installation of the show virtually. So we're very happy for that as well. So this is the entrance of the show, and you come in with the title wall. And here's Elias in his studio in Addis Ababa. So he has a very large studio in Addis, and he works, as I said, on these modular pieces. And what I mean by modular is very literal. He has small pieces of plywood, which are about 18 inches by 12. And you can see him standing here with them. And he works on each panel, and he breaks the computer parts. He cuts them, he weaves wires, he alters keyboards, he cuts keys up and places them on different panels. And then he uses each of these individual panels to construct a tableau that looks from a distance as it's almost seamless work, but actually it's made out of these smaller modular works. And one of the things I found super interesting about Elias when I first started seeing him and hearing about his work and meeting with him is he works on the ground. So, Jackson Pollock was famous for painting on the ground. Sime constructs these panels and then he builds them on the ground. So you can see him standing with a couple of works that are in process. And oftentimes he won't see these pieces on the wall until they're installed in a museum. So it's kind of an interesting way to work where he thinks on these kind of small scale and then it creates this really, really large scale image. So Sime sources this material. He started off sourcing his material around 2008, 2009, almost primarily from the Mercado, which is an open air market in Addis Ababa. It's the largest open air market in Africa. And he began finding this kind of remnants of technology, the insides of computers that had been, kind of thrown away. Africa is a large site of dumping of e-waste. So sometimes they would just be piles of what we would consider in some ways garbage or obsolete technology. And he started seeing this real beauty in the materiality of these objects. And he started to think about what it would mean to really utilize these in a collage and sort of think about them as the components of an aesthetic design. And Sime actually attended art school under the Derg regime. So he started out working within a very socialist, realist, naturalistic framework, but one that also looked at sort of global art movements. And some of his teachers had even come from Moscow. He has a very interesting background in terms of how he came to think about art as being very international, but also grounded within his Ethiopian context. And he ended up kind of majoring, as you would say, in design. So I think you can see as we go through these, a lot of the design elements kind of fit into the way the works are constructed. But after school, he sort of realized he needed to find his own way of working, and he needed to kind of discover what his vision as an artist was, kind of separate himself from both the socialist realist school after the regime fell, and also kind of move away from graphic design or kind of reproduction in that way. And one of the first things he started working with was collage. And you can see how he continued really working with collage even into these works. So he started out with more everyday found materials from yarn and buttons and things like that, to really thinking about what it meant to repurpose the detritus of technology. So in around 2008, he started this series, which you'll see this title come up a lot in these works, that's Tightrope. And for him, the series began in terms of thinking about technology and our relationship as human beings to this technology as kind of walking on a tightrope. And so for him, the material is both something that's coming out of intense amounts of progress, innovation, bridging gaps between people, but also it's a different form of interface. It's a sort of dehumanizing interface. It's something that takes away person to person interaction. So he's thinking about the materiality of technology as always kind of existing in this tension and this kind of on this kind of tightrope. So here you can see one of the works where he's taken these motherboards. It's this kind of creamy colored motherboard, and he's created this modular work out of it. And it's got this really beautiful kind of all over abstract feel to it. And here I want to show you a close up because when you see the details, they're really beautiful. So you can see all of the little tiny components that he's cut into little pieces and placed onto these plywood backings. And for this one, he used this singular type of motherboard. So that's another thing about his work is he actually it takes a long time for him to compile all of this material. He doesn't just have it all at once. So he has to sort of think through what he's looking at. He starts to collect items and then he'll make some panels, but he has to wait until he has enough material, enough wire, enough of a single color motherboard to actually create the entire very large scale work. And he told us recently when Molly and I were chatting with him that it's getting harder and harder. Some of these objects are becoming so obsolete that it's harder and harder to find them. And actually this kind of motherboard was one of those. And so here you can see two works from the show in an installation shot, the one we were just discussing, and this other work. And you can start to see how Elias has this push and pull, this kind of tandem experience with what this technological material can show, the kind of all over abstraction, but also you start to see him pushing into really thinking about what it means to create a vision of a landscape or something kind of as an aerial view. And this has become a really important element of his work. And I'm going to pass it on to Molly to kind of talk more about that in his practice.
Thanks, Hannah. So like Hannah mentioned, Elias works both in abstraction and also in works that are inspired by landscape, inspired by human figures and animal figures, and sort of combinations of both abstraction and figuration. And this is a really beautiful example of one of the abstractions Elias Sime makes that can be read or almost look like landscapes as seen from above or from an aerial perspective. And in the work, what you're actually seeing are beige circuit boards and sort of grids of computer keys that look almost like the grids of buildings and streets of a city that are crossed by these streets or sort of rivers or something of this gray braided wire. And it's really tempting to try to sort of identify what city this might be. But in fact, Elias Sime in these works is not actually representing any particular or identifiable locations. Instead, he's more playing with the aesthetics of landscape and of these sort of aerial views that we associate with technologies that we're so familiar with, like satellite imaging and Google Maps and even air travel. These technologies that cross vast distances and are able to connect people around the world. Next. And so this is another work by Elias Sime that's also, again, it's an abstraction, but it's also sort of looking at landscape traditions. It's an abstracted landscape. And here what you're seeing are computer keys that form these sort of square-like shapes sticking up that resemble icebergs floating on this watery surface that's made by braided wires below. And the iceberg is a sort of a common trope in landscape painting, especially from the 19th century of sort of sublime landscape painting. So these are all things that Elias is very familiar with and is playing off of in the work. Next. And you have to see this amazing detail where you can really see the texture of the work. It's these braided sort of stripped wires that are in the background that are connected to those plywood boards by small nails. And then you can see these beige sort of computer keys that are another one of those materials that, like Hannah mentioned, are actually sort of becoming difficult to come by because computer keys are not made in this way anymore. And I think we have another close-up next. Yeah, and so you can see this amazing texture. And this is another way that Elias crafts these compositions. It's not just with variations in color, but also these variations in texture that create these distinctions. Next. And here's another of these sort of works that is looking at aerial landscape views. This one's made out of these green circuit boards. And this one's really amazing. This was our art handler's favorite piece in it, because it really looks actually almost like sort of Midwestern farm landscapes or something seen from above. So it's sometimes sort of familiar in a certain way. And it's also got this amazing texture where these components of the piece really just stick up from the wall. It's really dimensional. Next.
One thing about this, as Molly was saying, so, and it'll lead into the next work. So in December of 2019, Elias and his creative partner, who's an anthropologist, Mescaram Azagard, they came to St. Louis, and they actually flew in on Christmas Day, and I met up with them on the day after Christmas to give them a tour. And this is one of the works he made immediately after he returned from St. Louis to Ethiopia. And so he doesn't ever like to say things have a singular meaning. Elias is really interested in interpretive qualities and the fact that what we see in things is also really personal. But for me, after he flew from here to there and then made this piece, I couldn't help but think that the flight over the Midwest probably had some influence in how this ended up looking. So we like to take a little credit in St. Louis that, you know, some of these were inspired by the city and his very short but very lovely visit to our museum. And that leads into this work. You can see this bowl-like shape in the front of the gallery. So after visiting St. Louis, the show really changed dramatically. And it was one of the things that about Currents that's always exciting for Molly and I is artists are constantly producing and changing and rethinking what the show's going to be up until basically until they have to put the objects into crates and get them onto the truck or the plane. And we had no idea that Sime had been considering making sculpture. He really hadn't done a lot of sculpture. He'd done a few large scale outdoor sculptures. But after his visit, he decided to make two brand new, very large for indoor scale sculptures. These weigh like 550 pounds. But the first place we went on the visit was to Cahokia Mounds. So he wanted to see Cahokia, and he wanted to see the arch, and he wanted to see the park and the museum. And so we drove out to Cahokia, and it was, you know, a weird winter day where it was actually like 60 degrees in St. Louis in December. And we had this really beautiful morning to go stand on Monk's Mound and look out. And you see a lot of the colors from a kind of Midwestern winter in these sculptures. And he came back and was just so inspired by this kind of curvilinear shape that he felt he saw over and over again in the St. Louis landscape, but also how that mirrors global historic cultures. So there are indigenous Ethiopians that created mounds, ancient mounds. He was really interested in how some of these forms and some of this kind of the sort of curved shape, both as a bowl, as an offering and kind of opening up, but also as this site where you could climb up a mound, as an arch, as a gateway. So he really started thinking about these things as part of the show. And so this is called Eyes and Ears of a Bat. And the kind of shapes you see that are made out of the braided woven wire flying around the outside are bat shapes. So again, he's kind of playing with this landscape animal abstraction. Here you can see a close-up of these sculptures. They're really incredible. So they, unlike the modular wall pieces, are all one form. So it was a curved piece of plywood. He built the entire structure out, and then he attached these woven wires with nails across the entire surface of two of these giant objects. And they're about 5 feet tall and like 7 feet across. So they are very substantial when you're in a room with them. We definitely had some fun with large scale, trying to get them in place was a bit of a project for our art handlers, but they're used to that. And here's the interior of the sculpture. So you can see this kind of, it looks almost like two fish, but it's very abstract. And he was really thinking about these different elements of nature and of movement that he was inspired by after this trip. But when we first found out about these objects, we actually received an email from the studio, and these are the pictures we were sent. So this is part of our fun curatorial process, is we didn't realize they were bowl shaped until after a few conversations with the artist. We at first were like, oh, he's made mounds. They're literal kind of representations of the visit. And then he decided to flip them upside down. and to allow it to be more of this kind of inverted bowl shape. So it's one of those interesting things when you work with artists, is you're always in dialogue as to what is happening, and you get to actually be a part of the conversations of how art gets created. And it's a really exciting aspect of the entire process of working with living artists as they make new work. This is the other bowl, Eyes and Ears of a Bat 2, and it's much more muted. It almost has this kind of soft, watery feel to it. It's all woven wires attached to a wooden bowl, and you can see the inside of it here. And here you can see it in juxtaposition to another piece in the show that Molly will talk about here in a bit. But they're really extraordinary pieces, and we're really lucky to have had them in the show and sort of have that connection to St. Louis. And here's an installation shot where you can see the second one in the galleries at the museum. And to get that kind of tilt also it took a lot of time with a gurney. So one of the fun curatorial facts. Molly?
Thanks, Hannah. So this is actually another of these works where Elias Sime is using woven wire. This is actually a really tall work. It's like 16 feet tall. So it's basically reaching almost up to the top of our gallery, sort of stretching the capacity of what we're able to show, which is interesting because we have pretty tall walls. But it's this really beautiful work made of these woven wires that Elias Sime weaves using a really interesting technique. It's a technique that is actually an Ethiopian hair braiding technique that he learned from female relatives of his, that he uses for these technological components to create these sort of braids. And then he sort of weaves the braids around and tacks them down using these small nails. And even though, in this picture, this almost looks like sort of a monochrome, when you get close to it, there's really so much sort of variation in this wave-like almost forms that are created by the patterns in this abstraction. So it's really quite incredible to look at up close. And when you step away, the nails are not so visible except at the top, because it hits up so close to the top of the gallery that really these nails actually become illuminated by the gallery lights, and they sort of sparkle at the top. So it's been sort of interesting seeing it in the actual space of the museum. But yeah, it sort of resembles these patterns, sort of moving water. Next. And this is another work, again, where these natural sort of forms and compositions are very important to the way that Elias works. They're really central to him. He really thinks of humans as being sort of inextricably connected both to nature and also to technology. And so here what you're actually seeing is a circuit board. It's pieces of green circuit board that are attached to those panels. And they look sort of like a monochrome, but when you look more closely, actually, Hannah, will you flip the next slide? I think I have a close-up. There's really so much incredible color variation going on, almost like a watercolor or something. That the qualities of these materials are really gorgeous. And it's just another reminder of how Elias thinks of these materials. They're not like to him like trash that he is recycling. He's searching for particular material qualities, like these sort of variations or sheen or texture. These are things that he's been looking for and collecting over time, and they really are gorgeous in person. And so here you see these circuit boards, and then there's these black sort of small little plastic rivulets that interrupt these more strictly gridded forms with these rivulets that almost look like waves on the surface of water. Next.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Molly and I recently had an opportunity to kind of get to talk to Elias a few times after the show was installed, and after he also got to see all of the works installed. And it's, as Molly was saying, he's really interested in these technological items as his materials, as art materials, and he doesn't like the word recycled, and he doesn't necessarily want to be seen within a sort of idea or legacy of art and technology. He's interested more in thinking about the term reclaimed or even reused, and really thinking about these things as having another life. And it's one of the aspects of the title. You can, if you've noticed, there was tightrope and then there's tightrope : noiseless. And he added that descriptor of noiseless to this series quite recently, just a few years ago, for a show at James Cohen Gallery. And for him, it was about this contemplative space, that these objects that are often used for forms of communication, telephones, computers, etc., are suddenly artworks that are meant to be contemplated. And he's interested in shifting what these objects do and how they function, but how they never lose their trace of their original use value. And I think that that, for me, can mean multiple things. And I think these kind of mixed interpretations is something he's really interested, because you see certain types of objects in his work, like those white keyboards. And for me, that's the keyboard I had when I was younger, and I don't have that keyboard anymore, but it has a real moment where I recognize it as something that means something to me, but then it's kind of made strange in this totally new, beautiful iceberg landscape that also reminds me of like a Caspar David Friedrich painting or a Turner. And he's interested in how these objects can bridge those different forms of communication. I don't know if you want to add anything, Molly, before we move into the other stuff.
No, I think you said it really well.
So this kind of fine art practice, which is what you'd see if you went to the show or if you looked at his works online, is very much what he does is his art practice, but Sime is kind of so much more than that. He also is just deeply committed to Addis Ababa, his hometown, and to thinking about what art means and what sustainability means to society. And in 2019, he opened the Zoma Museum, which you see here, which is an entirely sustainable, like literally entirely sustainable contemporary art center and art school in Addis. And he and his creative partner, Meskaram, did tons of research, looked at traditional Ethiopian building materials. They used the wattle and dowel building kind of, it's a kind of straw that's then mixed with dirt. It's historically what buildings in Ethiopia were made out of, but then they modernized it by Sime really putting his own aesthetic touch, as you can see with these decorations around the buildings. So it's a way of really modernizing and bringing into the contemporary moment the entire history of what Ethiopia has offered in terms of urban architectural planning. And he's trying to bridge the city and the country and create this place that's really genuinely very special. I think it was on some list of like top 10 places you should visit in the world recently. And it has a farm, so it has goats and has other things as part of the sustainability. It's solar. It has a lot of the water is cleaned through algae and other things. It's worth Googling. I'm not as much an expert in some of that stuff, but I know we have a wide range of people watching. It's really amazing. But I'll show you a few more pictures because it's a really gorgeous site, but it's also an art school. And it's an art school and a kind of community center for people who aren't necessarily professionals, as he likes to say. So Elias really uses a lot of help and studio help from people that he works with and he trains who want to know how he does what he does. He doesn't see them as needing to be what we consider professional artists. And so there's a large group of people who kind of live and work and relate within Zoma to his practice, and his studio is a part of it as well. Also recently, the Prime Minister of Ethiopia visited Zoma upon its opening and completion. And one of his projects that was supposed to open really right before the pandemic hit everybody was the making public of the palace in Addis Ababa, which had had a long and complicated history. It'd been the site of dictatorial regimes, the site of imperial power, and the prime minister decided to make it open and turn it into a community center for the city, and so open it up to the public for the first time. And he invited Sime and Meskaram to design the central garden area, which is called the community gardens. And so you can see here the walkway that they've been designing, and the way that the walls are designed as part of Sime's project. And so that was supposed to open. I don't actually know what the current schedule with everything happening over there is, but this is another side of the project that he's been working on. So Sime really is deeply invested in his town and in his community and what art really means to that community and to people in general. I mean, for Sime, art is what connects us. And he's really thinking about all of those things, and he means it so incredibly genuinely. It's really refreshing, I think, to think about art in these ways, that it could really have this basis in community, basis in sustainability, but also still keep its basis in real kind of aesthetic and material qualities. So I think that if we have questions, we could open it up to some questions now, because keep us within our hour.
I was just going to say that if you all have questions, if you would please put them in the Q&A, that helps us to answer them. I know there's some in the chat, so if you wouldn't mind putting your questions in the Q&A. And just a reminder that the Sime exhibition is open till basically the end of the month. So if you are in St. Louis and you have the opportunity to see it, we hope that you will. So yeah, please put your questions in the Q&A, and we can start out with a few, Hannah, that we received in advance, if that's cool with you. Yeah. So we had one question about someone who likes the upcycling and recycling in Sime's materials, and asks if there are any preservation or transportation challenges for the works, such as from Addis Ababa to the US.
Yeah, anytime that you're doing international shows, you have to deal with international shipping. But one of the things that's fantastic about Sime's work is, while they are sometimes, as Molly said, 16 feet tall and 8 feet wide, they're modular. So they actually get packed in a quite tidy package. So each individual panel comes off the wall, and they're all hung in these, grid systems. And so they actually are a little easier to ship. The bowls were definitely took some big elbow grease to get 550 pounds shipped from Africa, but it's not the most sustainable aspect of Sime's practice is the international shipping.
They're interesting in terms of installation too, the modular parts, because we don't get to move them around once they're on the wall, because they're installed piece by piece. So they have to be laid out, with tape in advance, and then once they're set, they're mostly set. So that was an interesting and different experience. We didn't get to move everything around a lot.
Yeah, it's true. With paintings, we're used to being able to just lean them against the wall and be like, oh, that looks good here, we'll switch it. And this one, they were like, nope, once you start, we're not rehanging 150 modular panels again.
Which kind of leads into the next question. I was thinking about our installation process. We had a question about how has the St. Louis Art Museum changed during the pandemic? So
I mean, yeah, everywhere has so much, but we were actually the first show to be installed after the closures of St. Louis were lifted. So this show was the first one that got installed, and it changed a lot about how the show was meant to go, as everybody had to face. Elias and Mesky were supposed to fly into St. Louis to be a part of the installation and do a public program the week that the museum shortly after the museum closed. So we had to push the show forward, and we had to do everything virtually. So the first time he saw the show was Molly and I carrying him and Mesky around on an iPad while they're sitting in Zoma looking at the show. So it was interesting, because we again had to use the sort of technological mediation that he's interested in some ways critiquing in the work as our only way of accessing the show in that moment. But otherwise, I think the museum's done a really, we're still open to the public, and all of the safety, protocols that the city has are in place. And I hope people have gotten the chance to see the show if they felt comfortable with the situation.
Okay, and we have another one that we received in advance. Is the current wave of using tech components in art a fad, or part of a true trend to recycle the innards of our machines into our view of art? Also, please discuss the integration of tech and art and the exploding array of tech-based works, including virtual exhibits that can only be seen through screens, projections, and non-tangible formats. It's a big one.
There's a couple of questions.
There's so many questions.
But in terms of the fad, I mean, I think Sime kind of exists outside of those things, again, because he's not using the technology as technology. He's saying that we create this stuff and it's here. It exists in the world. It doesn't break down. And when it does, it actually, causes a lot of environmental problems like mercury poisoning and other things. So he's in some ways reclaiming it as materials. And I think for him, that is really important. And sustainability in general is really important to him, as he's shown in his project at Zoma. But for him, this is very much about technology as existing regardless. And so I don't think it's a fad for him. I think that it can be seen sometimes, especially anytime there's new innovations, people use it. There was definitely a bit of a fad of art happening on Facebook or Twitter, and what its longevity is still to be seen. But I think with Sime, this is his material.
Yeah, his process is sort of surprisingly low tech in some ways. It's extremely manual. It's sort of almost lovingly handmade. The work that goes into braiding these wires and breaking up all these pieces and collaging them, it's very almost meditative and sort of low tech. And I'd like to just say that technology, there's lots of artists working with technology today, but when you really think of it in a long-term way, technology has been, part of art since dating back to the Renaissance. So that's not a new thing in a way, as artists is working with technology. It's sort of a long-standing theme if you think of it in a sort of wider way. Great, I'm going to check the Q&A and see what we've got. Any questions there? Are the wires secured to the plywood only by nails, or are they also glued down? And I think for the wires, it's all nails, right?
Yeah, it's
but
only
I think
nails.
Some of the other components are glued sometimes, I think.
Yes, the motherboards and the keyboards are often they use an adhesive, and then the wires are only nails, which I was surprised by. I thought that they were somehow glued down as well, but it's just nails.
Yeah, and the nails are really quite beautiful in their own way. Like I said, you almost don't notice them from far away, but when you get quite up close, they become sort of a part of the composition itself. So.
Yeah, Sime said at the beginning he was doing it as a literal technique, trying to adhere the wires to the panel, but then he started really liking the aesthetic. So now he thinks about it as really a component of the composition.
Okay, let's see. We have, has Sime embraced or anticipated the change in these materials over time in terms of the artwork? And I don't actually know the answer to that question.
That's a good question. We talked to him a little bit about some of these issues with not being able to find materials as much in the same way, and different things that he really missed. Like there's a red motherboard he says is almost impossible to find anymore. I don't know if he actively anticipated it, but he's very go with the flow, and all the different changes he really embeds in what he sees these materials doing and how they function. So I think for him, it's a little bit of having to also know that he's moving with technology.
We had one about how if he thinks of himself at all in relationship to Natsui or not. And we've had a question quite a bit actually, because the relationship between their work is quite interesting, because they're both using everyday aspects of everyday life that are kind of, in Natsui's case, it's bottle caps that are sort of repurposed and woven into sort of textiles, but it's a little bit different as well. I don't know if Sime sees himself closely in a relationship. I'm sure he's aware of Natsui, but there's definitely some connections there.
Yeah. I think that's a perfect answer. I think that art historically, we can absolutely see the connections in artists in Africa working with some of these materials, but there's actually a lot of artists all over the world working across these materials. And I think Sime himself and Natsui himself are kind of running in different spheres too.
We had a question about the panels and how they're sort of attached. Are they attached to each other or just abutting? And the answer is that they're attached to the wall. So I can just answer that one. They're not attached one to the other. They have to be carefully placed by our lovely art handlers to be, in a placement where they're touching, but they're not actually connected one to the other.
The little dirty secret is that you either paint black behind them or you tape black tape so that from a distance you don't see the white wall between the panels. So sometimes they don't even perfectly touch, but the illusion of the black paint makes it so that you can't see between them.
We had one hand about how you found Elias Sime for this show. Like, what was the process of identifying that you wanted to work with Elias Sime?
I saw his work at James Cohen Gallery years ago. And I just absolutely fell in love with it. So, and Jim Cohen's a WashU alum, so give him some good credit. It was really working with Jim, and he introduced me to Elias. But it was the kind of work, when you see it in person, it really does something. There's something really spectacular about the work. The scale, both the scale and the detail, is just incredible. So I really fell in love with it aesthetically. And then the more I learned, the more I was just so impressed by him as an artist and his history and how he sort of worked on this really global way, but also very connected to his own place. And that's something I'm always interested to. How do you bridge the global and the local? And he does it in these really interesting ways. And then using something as global as the global technology trade as a medium, it's just, I think there's just really amazing and interesting connections there.
Okay, let's see. We had one about, did Elias Sime begin with more traditional Ethiopian art styles before developing his distinctive style? Yeah, Hannah, do you want to say anything on that?
A little bit. That yes and no is the answer to that, because he really came also out of graphic design as well. And because he was in art school during a communist regime, they taught a very specific type of socialist realist art. So he was coming out of these different kind of competing styles, but he was definitely always interested in African and Ethiopian art. And his first stint after school was doing kind of portraits for tourists, which were done in a kind of style that would be recognizably Ethiopian, because of the desire for tourists to kind of have that as a souvenir. But he has this very global mentality about art, I think, because he was just had an eclectic background. You see a lot of the African influence in Zoma and what he does for some of these site-specific things. And his earlier work did have a very strong African influence, and he did some ceramics early. You can see that again mimicked in the mud walls of Zoma, but they do have more African influence.
Somebody asked if we had, well, first of all, if the show is traveling to the East Coast, and unfortunately not. You have to come to St. Louis if you want to see it, or you can experience it on our website, which is another one of the questions was about if there was a catalog or anything that could be mailed or downloaded. And the answer is that we have a brochure, and that brochure can be found on the website if you want to read a little bit more about Elias's work. So not a full catalog, but a brochure. Let's see what else we have. We had somebody asking about the history of like art with found objects, and Elias's relationship to that, like assemblage and those traditions. And
that's
art
interesting.
It's kind of interesting because he's using these found materials, but it's sort of different to me in the sense that he's really transforming them. Like, you can tell what they're from, but they don't appear to be. It's not like putting a computer on a pedestal or something. They're really kind of, he's interested in them as art materials, I guess, to me. And that's one distinction I see.
And also, so he started Tightrope in 2008. And I think that in some ways, a lot of the elements from early assemblage from the 60s, from Rauschenberg, from Jasper Johns, other things have been so they become so a part of acceptable art making. And Sime is kind of in some ways reversing a lot of that, where he's creating something that almost looks like a painting out of found materials instead of really using these found materials to create a sculpture that you can tell is made for them. You can both tell when you get close, but some of the wire pieces, if you walk away, you can't see, how the wires necessarily like start and end. Like there's a real almost painterly composition, especially to large abstract wire works. I feel like I have a couple more of the, you can see in this blue one too, like that's again, totally woven wires. So is this one in that's kind of mauvish. So he's working in this kind of way of bridging the use of this kind of assemblage material with a more traditional two-dimensional aesthetic.
Another question, oh, sorry, my video is off. Another question we received was if there's any painting involved in this work.
No.
The answer is no. But there is certainly a relationship to painting. If you see, there's a sort of a painterly way almost that he's using these materials and the format, you know, with these wall-hung works. There's certainly a gesture towards painting, but there is no painting.
No, like this is all wires and this is lit from above and head on. So all of those spaces where you see it kind of gets darker in the center of the top or on the bottom right-hand corner, that's all done with different colors of wires. So he's almost creating like shading with wires. It's a really incredible process and technique. But again, he's using these materials to create these almost illusions of painterly abstraction.
Someone has asked if we are going to retain an artwork for our collection.
We always hope. No decisions have been made yet, but it is always an option.
Yes. What other questions do we have here? Let me see. Sorry, it's always a new, always adapting to using technology, like all these Zoom presentations we've been doing. Okay, let's see. Are we aware of any American artists who are working with similar materials? I can think of anyone, you know, off the top of my head who's doing quite what Elias is doing.
Yeah, I can't think of anyone who's doing quite the same thing. Yeah, not immediately. Nothing immediately comes to mind.
Yeah, let's see. Hannah, should we just go through, oh, you were doing that, right? Going through the slides, showing some of the other works that we didn't talk about. Yeah.
This one's amazing. So this one's also really quite large. And all those little dots that you see around the red form are actually like 3 or 4 kind of nodes from a motherboard that he's extracted from the motherboard and kind of created a pattern within the woven wires that kind of looks like all of these little dots, an explosion out of the red form. And this is another one of the brand new works that was made for our show. And here's another one of these kind of more monochromatic. There's a lot of blue wires. That's one that he seems to get readily. So he has kind of series of these almost bluish, greenish monochromes that are really beautiful. They kind of almost look Van Gogh-ish or impressionistic in how the sort of curvilinear forms exist on each of the panels. And here you can see we got a question.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
No.
Got lots of questions just as fast as I can go through and read them. We had this is sort of like some of the things we talked about, but could you speak towards the history of recycling, reclaiming, reusing, repurposing material in the creation of art? More specifically, is there a tradition specific to a culture or time? I see a lot of art from the developing world using reclaimed material. Is this a function of the economy? It's a very
it's a lot.
It's a big question.
Yeah, I think there is a long history of reusing different things, materials and different things in various cultures, or there's a lot of taking things, animal elements, feathers, porcupine quills, and using things like that. For Sime, I can tell you this is not necessarily an economic issue with him. Ethiopia has been a site for a lot of e-waste dumping, so is most of Africa. But the Mercado is actually a site where things are sold and reused. So a lot of people would buy an old cell phone to get a part from it to fix their cell phone. And he came at it through just the amount of this kind of material that he saw at the market and thinking about really how to reutilize it kind of across, not just as a single part to part, or not as fixing an electronic item with another electronic item. Like, how do you find a different use for this kind of material? What is an aesthetic or material value? What can that come from kind of these obsolete objects? Because if you buy a cell phone, a broken cell phone for a part, then the rest of the cell phone is still trash. So he's also thinking about like how to really utilize all elements of it.
And for him, some of the materials have actually gotten quite expensive, as I understand, you know, and he really does actually collect these things and sort of stock them up until he has enough of a material that he's interested in to make a work. So.
And his early works, he used yarn a lot. And so he would make very similar composition, like similar looking objects to some of the woven wire pieces, but with yarn and buttons. And so for him, it really is coming out of an aesthetic value as well as this kind of conceptual framework.
Let's see. Well, I think we're running to the bottom of our questions list mostly.
Do we have maybe one, or is there like one more, or how?
Let me see.
About 10 minutes before we're really out of time.
Okay, sorry about that. Will his work be shown anywhere else in the USA?
Oh, so yes, it's currently actually at in a show at the Kemper Museum in Kansas City. But yes, he shows quite regularly. He has regular shows in New York with James Cohen Gallery, and then there's many places you can see his work. It's in the collection of the Met, it's at the Detroit Art Institute, many museums. So you can definitely come in contact with Sime's work all over the country.
One more we have, this is sort of like a combination statement and question. This person says, I have the impression that artists in the late 60s were running away from so many of the things that Sime embraces. Works on the wall that you can't enter into, like painting, collage-like structure, the aestheticization of everyday materials. Does that strike us too? And what do we make of this turn of events?
I think it's I think that's really interesting, and it's an incredibly interesting observation. And that's one of the things I think is so fascinating about Sime is he doesn't run from aesthetics, and he doesn't run from experience. And especially this new edition of Noiseless is he's really interested in that experience. And, you know, in abstraction, he's also interested in music and jazz and how these kind of things play into experientiality. So yes, there is something about him that is very different than what we think of as traditionally the historic avant-garde and the neo-avant-garde. And he's so genuine about it that it really works for me, because he allows the multiple readings of this material, of its social and political origins and structures, of its environmental impacts, to all reside within this otherwise kind of aesthetic experience. So yes, I think it's really interesting. I think it's really contemporary. I think it's really part of an internationalism and broadening of these kind of canonic ideas of art. And I think that he really doesn't shy away from believing that art, in this kind of individual one-to-one experience of you with the object, he believes that really means something.
Someone has asked if the materials are really universal or global, or if there are some sorts of technological materials, you know, circuit boards or such, that are associated, or colors that are associated with particular areas of the world.
Molly, you might know more about this than I do. I have to admit that my knowledge of the actual tech side of this has been minimal, and I should have probably asked a few more questions. I'm sure there are certain things, like
I think actually I remember when Elias was presenting in another program, he specifically mentioned something that was Russian, and it was like a Russian or Soviet circuit board that he really was interested in. And that sort of stuck out to me, that he was actually quite sort of interested and taken with the fact that he was able to identify where this was from. So he really does think about these sort of global connections to the materials, and that he could be touching something that someone used, in another part of the world that they'll never meet. These actual sort of human connections to the technology are something that he really thinks about and he really feels, I would say.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that the Mercado and that the site is interesting, is because it comes from all over the world. It's really like brought there and dumped in various different ways from all over the world. So yeah, he did tell a story about how it was Mescaram's brother or relative was like, oh, I know that piece. It's from this type of Soviet era motherboard. And I think that's probably true of many things, but you have to, like, you relate to this technology in different ways because of what you've come in contact with. So he mixes it all together. And in this way, then the same way I have this thing with those white keyboards, they'll always bring me back to, like, being in elementary school and typing on them. People relate to this stuff across the globe.
Yeah, I had those the white keyboards too. That one in particular sort of appealed to me because of that. It's like a tactile memory, sort of. Let's see. We had someone wanted to know the name of Elias's gallery in New York, which is James Cohen Gallery. Let's see what else we have. Well, I think that's just about everything. So yeah, I just want to thank everybody for joining us today. It was really a pleasure to talk about the exhibition. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks everybody so much for coming, and hopefully you'll get to either see the show or read the brochure or think a little more about Sime's work after seeing it.
Hannah and Molly, thank you so much. That was a fascinating and presentation, and I think those of us who are in St. Louis and feel comfortable enough to come to the museum, we probably will get out there and do that. So thank you so much. And for those of you attending, we encourage you to visit our digital resources and virtual connection page on the website. We've posted the link there for you. You can learn about other ways to connect with WashU alumni, students, and faculty and parents. We update this regularly with our upcoming events. And also, we hope we'll see you soon for a future program. Please let us know if you have any suggestions for topics or speakers, and email us at alumniassociation@woostel.edu. We've posted that there on the screen. Thank you all for joining us. Have a great evening.